Prelate Vorn of the Cygnian hegemony adjusted the fine mesh of his rebreather and surveyed the grand exchange of Cygnus Prime. It was, in his opinion, the most beautiful sight in the known galaxy. Not for its aesthetics, though the soaring, crystalline arches and holographic data streams were impressive, but for its perfect, immutable logic. For 3,000 standard years, the Galactic Concordance had operated on the principle of tangible value. An Grolbeckian agro unit, representing 1 metric ton of nutrient paste, could be exchanged for 1.7 kiloliters of refined helium-3 from a gas giant harvesting collective. The ratio was set by a complex but utterly rational calculation of energy expenditure. The calories fed to the Grolbeck, the fuel used to harvest the helium, the manpower, the transport. Prices were stable, adjusted once per standard decade by a council of impossibly intelligent AIs. It was a system free of ambiguity, of passion, of chaos. It was, in a word, civilized. Humanity's entry into this system had been a minor curiosity. They were a young, boisterous species from a gravitationally aggressive death world, possessing a bizarre aptitude for creative arts and counterintuitive engineering. Their initial contributions to the exchange were simple and tangible. They offered exquisitely crafted musical compositions in exchange for medical technology, rare earth spices for navigational charts, and unique carbon-based polymers for construction materials. They were small players, their total economic output barely a fraction of a percent of the Concordance's whole. Vorn had overseen their probationary application personally and found them peculiar but harmless. Their delegates were prone to strange rituals like handshakes and a disturbing tendency to make decisions based on gut feelings, but their ledgers were clean. Today, a new human trade delegation was scheduled to present a proposal to the Concordance Oversight Committee, of which Vorn was a senior member. The lead delegate was a woman named Anya Sharma. Vorn had reviewed her file. She was not a producer, a miner, or a manufacturer. Her title was investment strategist, a term that had no direct translation in the Cygnian language or indeed in the languages of most Concordance members. The closest approximation was gambling organizer, which was surely a mistranslation. Sharma entered the chamber flanked by 2 associates. She was small, even for a human, but moved with a confidence that seemed entirely disconnected from her physical presence. She smiled, a baring of teeth that Vorn's briefing materials assured him was a gesture of non-aggression, though his instincts screamed otherwise. Prelate Vorn, members of the committee, she began, her voice smooth and modulated by the universal translator. Humanity is honored to be a part of this ancient and prosperous economic union. We have studied your system of tangible value with great admiration for its stability, but we believe we have identified a potential area for enhanced efficiency. Vorn felt a slight flutter of his respiratory cilia, the Cygnian equivalent of a raised eyebrow. The system was already perfectly efficient. The transport of physical goods across vast stellar distances, Sharma continued, is the single greatest energy expenditure in our economy. A shipment of ore from Cygnus to the Sol system takes 2 standard months and consumes terajoules of power. It is a drag on our collective growth. What if I told you there was a way to trade the value of that ore without ever having to move the ore itself? Vorn and the other committee members exchanged glances of polite confusion. Trade the value, but not the object? The concept was a logical paradox. The value was the object. Anya Sharma activated the chamber's holographic display. A schematic of the galaxy appeared, with glowing lines representing major trade routes. Let us consider the mining consortium on Cygnus X1. They produce 1 million tons of quantium ore per cycle. The Grolbeck collectives in the Cetus Arm require this ore for their agricultural machinery. Currently, a fleet of freighters makes the journey. A massive, slow, expensive undertaking. She gestured, and the holographic freighters vanished. Instead, the Cygnus Consortium issues 1 million quantium vouchers. Each voucher is a legally binding promise, a certificate that entitles the bearer to 1 ton of ore, deliverable upon request. The Grolbecks needing the ore purchase these vouchers. You are describing a promissory note, Vorn interjected, his voice a dry rasp. This is a rudimentary credit system. We are familiar with it. It is useful only for small-scale, short-term transactions where trust is absolute. Exactly. Sharma beamed, her smile widening. But what if we expand the system? The Grolbecks buy the vouchers. Now they have a tangible asset, a claim on real ore. But perhaps a third party, say a Xylarian shipbuilder, needs to pay the Grolbecks for a shipment of nutrient paste. Instead of transferring currency units, they offer to buy a portion of the Grolbecks' quantium vouchers. They do this because they know that in the next cycle, a new shipyard opening in their system will need quantium, and they predict the demand will be higher. The committee was silent. Vorn felt a growing unease. Suddenly, Sharma said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the vouchers themselves have a value, separate from the ore they represent. A value based not on what the ore is worth today, but on what people believe it will be worth tomorrow. This is a futures market. It allows for price discovery and risk management. It transforms a static commodity into a dynamic asset. A hulking Grolbeck committee member rumbled, the value of the ore is the value of the ore. It does not change based on belief. This is illogical, is it? Sharma countered smoothly. If a blight strikes your nutrient vats and you need to build new machinery faster, isn't the ore needed for that machinery more valuable to you? If a new mining technology is discovered, making ore more plentiful, doesn't its value decrease? Your system only accounts for these changes once a decade. Ours accounts for them in real time, based on the collective knowledge and speculation of every market participant. It is a living, breathing entity. Vorn saw the trap, but it was wrapped in a seductive logic he could not immediately dismantle. The idea of a responsive, predictive market was appealing. The Concordance's decennial reevaluations were cumbersome. Reluctantly, the committee agreed to a limited trial. The Cygnus Quantium Consortium would be authorized to issue 100,000 vouchers on a new human-designed digital exchange. It was a small number, a rounding error in the galactic economy. Vorn consoled himself with the thought that the experiment, when it inevitably failed, would be a contained one. He did not realize he had just authorized the release of a pathogen. The Quantium Voucher Exchange, or QVE, went online one cycle later. For the first few weeks, it behaved as expected. The Grolbecks bought the vouchers for the standard price of quantium ore. A few other species made minor trades. It was a quiet digital replication of the physical market. Then the humans began to trade among themselves. They bought and sold the same blocks of vouchers dozens of times a day. The price began to fluctuate, at first by fractions of a percent, then by whole percentage points. A rumor of a potential stellar flare near a rival mine sent the voucher price soaring by 5% in a single day. When the rumor proved false, it dropped by 6% the next. To Vorn, this was insanity. The ore itself had not changed. It was still in the consortium's warehouses on Cygnus X1. Its tangible value was constant. Yet its market value was now a volatile, unpredictable wave. Then came the second mutation of the virus. Anya Sharma's firm, Terrafin, introduced a new product, QVE options. She explained it to the bewildered Concordance Economic Council as a form of risk management. It's simple, she'd said, the baring of her teeth seeming sharper than ever. Say you are a Grolbeck who has bought vouchers but are worried the price might fall. You can purchase a put option. This gives you the right, but not the obligation, to sell your voucher at today's price at some point in the future. It's insurance. And if we believe the price will rise? The Grolbeck ambassador had asked, his deep voice rumbling with confused interest. Then you buy a call option, Sharma had replied. The right to buy vouchers at today's price in the future. If the price goes up, you exercise your option and make a profit on the difference. Vorn felt a cold dread crystallize in his thoughts. They were no longer trading vouchers for ore. They were now trading the right to trade the vouchers. They were creating a second layer of value, completely disconnected from the first. They were trading in the abstract concept of risk itself. They were selling the future. The effect was intoxicating. Species whose economies had been stable and predictable for centuries were suddenly seeing incredible returns. A Xylarian shipping magnate made more in 1 week trading QVE options than his entire fleet of freighters made in a year. He promptly diverted capital from building new ships to buying more options. Why invest in the slow, difficult process of creating tangible value when one could simply surf the waves of speculation and generate wealth from nothing? Vorn presented a report to the High Committee, filled with dire warnings. He showed them charts demonstrating that the total notional value of the QVE options market was now 10 times the value of the actual quantium ore it was based on. He argued that this was a phantom economy, a house of cards built on nothing more than collective belief. The committee listened politely. They pointed to the data streams showing unprecedented wealth creation. The system was working, they said. Vorn was an arch-conservative, unable to grasp this new dynamic paradigm. They thanked him for his caution and approved the expansion of the human-led financial markets to include helium-3, nutrient paste, and even luxury goods. The virus was now airborne. The final and most virulent stage of the infection arrived under the guise of liquidity. Anya Sharma's team unveiled the Concordance Universal Market, a grand unification of all the new futures and options exchanges, and with it came two new tools, leverage and short selling. Leverage, she explained, allowed an investor to borrow capital against their existing assets to buy even more. It amplified their purchasing power. Short selling was its dark twin, the ability to borrow an asset, sell it, and then buy it back later at a lower price, profiting from its decline. To Vorn, this was the logical endpoint of the madness. The humans had not only created a way to profit from imaginary growth, they had now created a way to profit from imaginary failure. A trader could now become wealthy by betting that an entire industry would collapse. They could even, through coordinated short selling, cause that collapse. It was economic predation refined to a mathematical art form. Vorn watched in horror as the Cygnian hegemony itself, his own people, succumbed to the fever. The assembly, swayed by projections of infinite growth, began to liquidate portions of its strategic titanium reserves, real, tangible metal used to build their fleets and cities, to invest in the universal market. They leveraged the hegemony's assets to the hilt, chasing the impossible returns promised by the human strategists. The hegemony's ledgers, once a testament to millennia of prudent, physical wealth, were now bloated with intangible, speculative assets. He confronted Anya Sharma in the halls of the Grand Exchange, the data streams around them flashing with frantic billion-unit trades. "What you have created is not an economy," Vorn rasped, his cilia vibrating with suppressed fury. "It is a weapon. You have weaponized hope and fear. You have built a universe of promises with nothing to back them up." Sharma looked at him, and for the first time, her smile did not seem like a gesture of peace. It looked predatory. Prelate economics has always been about belief. Your system was built on the belief that a ton of ore is worth a ton of ore. Our system is built on the belief that tomorrow can be worth more than today. It's just a more ambitious faith. That night, Vorn sat in his observatory staring at the main display. He had programmed it to show a single metric, the total leveraged value of the universal market versus the total tangible value of the assets it supposedly represented. The ratio had just passed 1,000 to 1. 1,000 currency units of speculative promises for every 1 unit of actual physical goods in the entire concordance. The graph was a near vertical line, a skyscraper reaching for the heavens, and Vorn, who had spent his life studying the rigid logic of numbers, knew one immutable, tangible truth. Things that go straight up must eventually come straight down. He wasn't just looking at a financial bubble. He was looking at the silent, ticking detonator of a bomb that would bankrupt the galaxy. And the humans, he realized, were the only ones who knew how to profit from the blast. The first tremor was so subtle it was almost missed. Amidst the roaring ocean of the universal market, it was a single, misplaced ripple. The Xylarian haulers conglomerate, a respectable mid-tier shipping operation, released its quarterly earnings report. They had projected a 4.2% growth in tonnage miles. The actual number was 4.1%. In the old concordance economy, such a minuscule deviation would have been a statistical footnote, irrelevant to the company's tangible value of fleets and contracts. In the new economy, where value was a fever dream of future expectation, it was a catastrophe. Within seconds of the report's release, Xylarian haulers' stock value plummeted by 30%. Vorn, monitoring the data streams from his private observatory, immediately saw the predator's teeth in the numbers. A coordinated block of short-selling orders had been placed nanoseconds before the report went public. It was a clear case of what the humans called insider trading, but on a scale and at a speed that was impossible to prove. The human firm Terrafin, Anya Sharma's creation, posted a single-day profit from that one event equivalent to the entire annual GDP of a small moon colony. The panic, however, was contained. The wider market dipped but did not dive. The sheer momentum of belief was too strong. But for Vorn, it was the definitive sign. It was the sound of a single pebble falling, heralding the coming avalanche. He immediately convened a private meeting with the Signian hegemony's financial ministers. He laid out the data, the impossible odds of the terrafin trade, the clear evidence of market manipulation. He begged them to begin a controlled, quiet divestment from the universal market. "We must decouple," Vorn urged, his voice tight with desperation. "We must convert these digital ghosts back into ore, ships, and infrastructure, while they still have any perceived value." The ministers looked at him with a mixture of pity and condescension. "Prelate, your caution is noted as always," said Minister Kale, the primary architect of the hegemony's market strategy. "But our leveraged positions have increased the hegemony's net worth by a factor of 20. To pull out now would be to abandon the greatest economic expansion in our history. The Xylarian matter was an isolated correction. The fundamentals are strong. Fundamentals." It was a human word they had adopted, and like its creators, it was slippery and vague. It meant nothing. The only fundamental truth Vorn could see was that the hegemony's wealth was a hostage to the whims of a system designed by predators. His people were no longer investors. They were marks in a confidence game of galactic proportions, and they were too proud and too greedy to see it. He left the meeting feeling the profound chill of inevitability. He had shown them the crack in the dam, and they had decided to admire the view from the top. As whispers of the Xylarian hauler's collapse began to circulate, a faint current of anxiety ran through the Concordance. It was not yet panic, but the boundless optimism was, for the first time, tinged with doubt. Anya Sharma responded not with reassurance, but with a display of breathtaking audacity. She called for an emergency session of the Concordance Oversight Committee, framing it not as a defense of her system, but as an opportunity to accelerate its adoption. She stood before them, a picture of calm and control in the center of the Grand Exchange Chamber. The holographic tickers surrounding her flickered with nervous energy. "Esteemed members of the Concordance," she began, her voice resonating with a carefully crafted sincerity. "We have experienced what in human markets is a common and healthy event, a market correction. Weaker, less efficient assets have been culled, and capital is now free to flow towards more robust opportunities. This is not a moment for fear. This is a moment for boldness." Vorn watched, mesmerized by her performance. She was a master manipulator of belief. She reframed the Xylarian collapse not as a failure, but as a success of the system's self-regulating nature. She introduced a new lexicon of comforting nonsense. The market was merely testing a new floor. Investors were taking profits off the table. It was time for those with conviction to buy the dip. The language was a hypnotic chant, and the committee was enthralled. They so desperately wanted to believe their paper fortunes were real that they would accept any explanation that allowed them to continue the fantasy. "To that end," Sharma announced, gesturing to the tickers, "Terrafin proposes the creation of a concordant stabilization fund, a pool of capital, contributed by all member worlds that can be used to purchase assets during moments of high volatility. This will ensure market stability, protect investor assets, and project an image of unshakable confidence to the galaxy." It was the most brilliant, insidious proposal Vorn had ever heard. She was asking the Concordance to give her their actual, tangible wealth, their reserves of precious metals, their energy credits, their physical resources, so she could use it to buy the very speculative assets she had created from thin air. She was convincing the patient to pay for the privilege of deepening their addiction. Vorn rose to object. "This is madness," he projected, his voice echoing in the chamber. "You are asking us to throw good money after bad. We would be pouring our tangible reserves into a phantom economy. It is not a stabilization fund. It is a sacrifice to a false god." But it was too late. The allure was too strong. The Grolbeck ambassador, whose people had seen their net worth quintuple, rumbled his support. The Xylarians, desperate to recover their losses, eagerly agreed. One by one, the member worlds pledged their resources to the fund, which would, of course, be managed by a consortium of experts hand-picked by Anya Sharma. The vote was nearly unanimous. Vorn abstained, a lone voice of reason in a chorus of lemmings charging towards a cliff. The stabilization fund was created. Sharma now had a war chest funded by her own victims. The parasite had convinced the host to feed it directly. The stabilization fund worked for a time. Its massive infusion of capital into the universal market acted like a powerful stimulant. driving prices to new, even more ludicrous heights. The Xylarian dip was forgotten, dismissed as a minor blip on the path to infinite prosperity, but Vorn knew it had only delayed the inevitable and magnified the scale of the coming disaster. The system was now more leveraged, more bloated, and more unstable than ever before. The avalanche was still coming. It had just gathered more snow. The true catalyst came from the Grolbeck agro-collectives. Emboldened by the market's recovery, they had leveraged their assets to a degree that made Vorn's cilia curl. They had borrowed against their farms, their fleets, their processing plants, their nutrient-paced futures, everything, and poured it all into highly speculative derivatives, many of which were terra-fin creations. They were no longer farmers. They were gamblers betting the galactic food supply on a rigged wheel. The trigger was a minor shipping lane disruption caused by an unexpected solar storm. A few freighters carrying nutrient paste were delayed by a week. In the old economy, this would cause a temporary, localized price fluctuation. In the new economy, it was a death sentence. The price of nutrient paste futures flickered, dropping by 2%. For the hyper-leveraged Grolbecks, this small drop was all it took. Their losses, amplified by their borrowing, were catastrophic. They received a margin call. A margin call was a uniquely human invention of exquisite cruelty. It was a demand from a lender to deposit further funds to cover potential losses. The Grolbecks had no more funds. Their only option was to sell their assets to cover the call. But they couldn't sell them fast enough. The automated trading algorithms, most of them run by human firms, detected the beginning of the Grolbeck liquidation. They saw blood in the water. In a matter of minutes, a cascade of automated sell orders flooded the market. The price of nutrient paste futures plummeted, not by 2% but by 20%. Then 50%. The Grolbecks were forced to sell everything, their stocks, their options, and finally their tangible assets. Vouchers for entire fleets of agro ships were dumped onto the market for a fraction of their real value. The contagion spread instantly. Every other species that had invested in nutrient paste futures was now facing margin calls of their own. The chain reaction had begun. Xylarians were forced to sell their helium-3 futures to cover their nutrient paste losses, which in turn crashed the helium-3 market, forcing the Cygnian hegemony to liquidate their quantium ore options. Each bankruptcy triggered a dozen more in a domino effect of cascading failure that ripped across the galaxy at the speed of light. Vorn watched from his observatory, his analytical mind detached, an academic observing the heat death of a universe. The tickers were no longer flickering. They were solid waterfalls of crimson. The stabilization fund, which was supposed to prevent this very scenario, was drained in less than an hour, its vast resources utterly consumed by the black hole of collapsing value. He brought up the hegemony's financial status. The 20-fold increase in their net worth had been erased. Their tangible reserves, which they had foolishly pledged to the fund, were gone. In the space of a single day, his people, one of the oldest and proudest civilizations in the Concordance, had been rendered destitute. The event was later recorded in galactic history as the Great Collapse. It was not a war, fought with ships and weapons, but it was just as devastating. In less than a standard day, 3,000 years of stable, predictable economic progress was wiped out. The Galactic Concordance was functionally bankrupt. Planetary governments defaulted on their obligations. Pensions vanished. Industries ground to a halt as the credit systems that fueled them ceased to exist. The intricate web of trade that bound the galaxy together had been vaporized, replaced by a miasma of debt, distrust, and worthless digital promises. From the observation deck of the Grand Exchange, Vorn surveyed the chaos. The soaring chamber, once a symbol of logic and order, was now a scene of despair. The holographic tickers no longer showed prices. They displayed stark, brutal messages. Market closed. Trading suspended. System failure. Ambassadors and ministers drifted through the space like ghosts. Their faces, or the equivalent parts of their anatomy, etched with utter ruin. They had believed in a miracle, and now they were left with the ashes. With a grim, methodical sense of purpose, Vorn accessed the secured servers of the Exchange's Regulatory Commission. He had a single burning question that needed an answer. Amidst this universal carnage, who had profited? He filtered the day's transactions, stripping away the trillions of panicked sell orders, and focused only on the accounts that had ended the day with a positive balance. The list was shockingly, horrifyingly short. At the very top, with profits so vast that the number required a new mathematical notation to be properly displayed, was Terrafin. Below it were a dozen other human-owned investment firms. While the rest of the galaxy had been leveraging their assets to bet on infinite growth, the humans had been quietly, patiently using that same borrowed capital to bet against it. They had shorted every major index, every commodity, every blue-chip company. They had purchased put options on entire sectors of the economy. They had built a financial doomsday weapon, and then, when the time was right, they had pushed the button. Vorn finally understood. The boom was not the point. The prosperity was just the bait. The real goal had always been the bust. The humans hadn't created a system for generating wealth. They had created a system for transferring it. They had encouraged the entire galaxy to build a single magnificent tower, and then, as everyone moved their valuables into the penthouse, they sold the demolition contract to themselves. Anya Sharma appeared beside him, her expression not one of triumph but of somber, almost philosophical calm. "A tragedy," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But every collapse is a foundation for a new kind of growth. A rebuilding." Vorn turned to face her, his rebreather hissing in the sudden silence of the ruined exchange. "You didn't just collapse our economy," he said, the words heavy with the weight of his realization. "You bought it, all of it. Our ships, our mines, our farms, our infrastructure. You didn't conquer us with warships. You conquered us with a balance sheet." Sharma gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "The market corrected itself, prelate. Someone had to be there to pick up the pieces. Welcome to the human economy." The great galactic bazaar was closed. A new one was about to open under new management. In the cycles that followed the great collapse, a strange, unnerving silence fell across the galaxy. The frantic, screaming tickers of the universal market were dark. The torrent of intersystem data chatter slowed to a trickle. It was the silence of a battlefield after the slaughter, a profound quiet filled with the ghosts of vanquished fortunes. Prelate Vorn spent this time not in grief, but in grim, relentless accounting. With the last of his authority, he accessed the Concordance's central asset registry, cross-referencing it with the final transaction logs from the market's dying moments. He was not merely assessing the damage, he was mapping the geography of his galaxy's conquerors. The picture that emerged was one of elegant, absolute totality. The Grolbeck agro-collectives, which had fed 1,000 worlds, were now wholly owned subsidiaries of a human corporation called Agrisol. The vast Xylarian shipyards, builders of the finest freighters in the Concordance, now operated under the banner of the Sol Unified Shipping Guild. The quantium mines of his own people, the bedrock of the Cygnian hegemony's industrial power for millennia, were now the legal property of terrestellar resources. It was the same for every major industry. On every significant world, the humans had not used the incomprehensible wealth they'd gained from their short-selling to simply buy luxury goods or build palaces. They had reinvested it with the speed and precision of a surgical strike. During the market's freefall, as panicked institutions dumped their assets for any price they could get, the human firms had been the only buyers. They hadn't just bought stocks. They had bought the companies themselves. They had purchased the debt of bankrupt governments for fractions of a percent of its original value. Vorn finally understood the most devastating part of the strategy. Humanity did not just own the galaxy's means of production. They owned its debt. They were the sole creditor in a galaxy of bankrupts. The Cygnian hegemony did not just have to ask humanity for permission to use its own mines. It owed humanity a debt so large that it could not be repaid in 10 lifetimes. It was not a military occupation which could be fought and resisted. It was a foreclosure. The galaxy had been leveraged and humanity had called in the loan. They had conquered 1,000 worlds without firing a single shot, and the galaxy had signed the surrender papers itself on the dotted line of a margin call. The second wave of the human invasion was not comprised of soldiers, but of accountants, lawyers, and middle managers. They arrived on worlds still reeling from the economic apocalypse, carrying not weapons but briefcases. They did not issue commands. They scheduled meetings. On Cygnus Prime, Vorn was permitted to observe one such meeting. Minister Kale, the same official who had once dismissed Vorn's warnings, sat opposite a young, smiling human named David Chen. Chen's title was Chief Restructuring Officer for the Cygnus Sector. He was polite, deferential and utterly implacable. Minister Kale, Chen began, placing a data slate on the table. Terrestellar Resources understands that this is a difficult transition. We are not here to disrupt your culture. We are here to restore stability and productivity. The quantium mines have been dormant for a full cycle. That is inefficient. We need to get your people back to work. Kale's cilia quivered with indignation. Your mines? Our people? This is our world. Chen's smile never wavered. According to the articles of the Galactic Concordance, which the hegemony ratified, transfers of ownership executed on the universal market are legally binding. Terrestellar now holds the deed. However, we are not interested in direct operational control. We prefer to empower local leadership. He pushed the slate across the table. This is our offer. We will appoint you Regional Director of Mining Operations. A generous salary, paid in the new stable Sol credits, backed by the full faith and credit of the Sol Federation. You will oversee the day-to-day work. Your people will be fed. They will be paid. The mines will produce again. All we require is that 80% of the output is transferred to Terrestellar's holdings. It was a slave contract gift wrapped as an employment offer. It was feudalism disguised as corporate management. Kale looked at the slate, his pride warring with the stark reality of his situation. His people were starving. The old Concordance credit was worthless. Without the humans, there was no food, no energy, no future. With them, there was servitude. Across the galaxy, the same scene was playing out. Grolbeck chieftains became agricultural supervisors. Xylarian fleet admirals were offered positions as logistics coordinators. The humans weren't killing the old leaders. They were hiring them. They were co-opting the existing power structures, making them instruments of human economic will. They were turning shepherds into sheepdogs, faced with the choice between rebellion and ruin or cooperation and survival. One by one, the civilizations of the old Concordance chose to survive. They chose the gilded cage. Vorn knew he had to speak with Anya Sharma one last time. He requested a meeting, pulling the last strings of his old authority. He was surprised when she granted it immediately. He met her not in a grand chamber, but in a small quiet lounge overlooking the now-defunct Grand Exchange. She looked different, less like a predator on the hunt and more like an architect surveying a finished creation. Why? Vorn asked. The single word containing the weight of a ruined galaxy. Was it simply for wealth? For power? Was it malice? Sharma took a slow sip of a steaming, dark liquid from a ceramic cup. The aroma was bitter and alien. Do you know what the first human economic system was, prelate? A hungry tribe sharing the meat from a mammoth kill. One hunter might be strong, another fast, another clever. If the strong hunter kept all the meat, the fast one couldn't chase the next mammoth, and the clever one couldn't invent a better spear. The tribe would die. But if they shared, believing that cooperation would lead to more mammoths tomorrow, they prospered. Economics for us has always been a story we tell ourselves about the future. Vorn remained silent, listening. Your concordance, she continued, gesturing to the dead exchange below, told itself a story of perfect static value. That a ton of ore would always be a ton of ore. It was a beautiful, logical, and fragile story. It could never account for a sudden storm, a new invention, or a moment of fear. It was brittle. Humanity's story is different. It's a chaotic, ugly, terrifying story. It's a story of booms and busts, of bubbles and crashes, of hope and greed and panic. It's a mess. But it's strong. It adapts. Every crash is a forest fire that clears out the dead wood and allows for new growth. We don't fear the cycle. We are the cycle. You call this chaos growth? Vorn asked, his voice a dry rasp. You have impoverished billions. We have impoverished no one, Sharma corrected him gently. We simply revealed that their wealth was an illusion, built on a faulty premise. Now we will rebuild. We will create a new system, a dynamic one, a human one, a system that can bend without breaking. We didn't conquer you, prelate. We introduced you to the fundamental nature of a chaotic universe, which we have been navigating for our entire history. This wasn't an act of war. It was a teachable moment. Vorn finally saw the terrifying truth. The humans did not see their economic virus as a weapon. They saw it as a vaccine. They had destroyed the galaxy's placid, sterile immune system to replace it with their own, one that was chaotic, painful, and brutally, relentlessly effective. Anya Sharma leaned forward, her expression turning from philosophical to pragmatic. The other species, they will not understand this. They will see only their loss. They will resist, they will drag their feet, they will cling to the memory of the old simple ways. They will be inefficient. And in the new economy, inefficiency is death. She looked at Vorn, her eyes sharp and analytical. But you, prelate, you understand. You saw the patterns. You understood the logic of our illogic. You knew what was coming before anyone else did. Vorn felt a cold stillness settle over him. He knew what was coming next. The new order needs administrators, Sharma said, her voice matter of fact. It needs managers who can bridge the gap between our methods and their cultures. It needs translators not of language but of philosophy. We are forming a Galactic Reconstruction Authority. Its purpose will be to manage the transition, to integrate the former Concordance worlds into the human economic sphere, to teach them the rules of the new game. She slid a data slate across the table, the same model David Chen had offered to Minister Kale. On it was a single document, a contract. It offered him the position of non-human director on the authority's board. The compensation was astronomical, but that was not what held Vorn's attention. It was the scope of the authority being offered. He would be in a position to mitigate the damage, to cushion the blow for his people and others, to guide them through the terrifying new world the humans had created. He was being offered a choice. He could refuse, retain his honor, and fade into irrelevant history as his people and his galaxy were reshaped by forces they could not comprehend, or he could swallow his pride, take the offered hand and step into the heart of the machine. He could become a part of the virus in the hopes of steering its evolution. He thought of the hungry tribe and the mammoth. He thought of the forest fire and the new growth. He finally understood the story humanity told itself about the future. It was a story of survival at any cost. Looking at Anya Sharma, he realized that for his people, and for the entire galaxy, the only path to survival was to learn how to tell that same story. He extended a thin, three-fingered hand and tapped his acceptance on the glowing screen. "Welcome aboard." "Director Vorn," Anya Sharma said, and this time when she smiled, it was not the baring of a predator's teeth. It was the welcoming grin of a colleague. The conquest was over. The onboarding had just begun.